In 1943, the United States Air Forces had a problem, a big problem. They were losing the air war over Europe. The numbers told the story. On October 14, 1943, the 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses to bomb the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt, Germany. 60 bombers were shot down. That's over 600 men killed or captured in a single mission. Another 138 bombers came back so badly damaged they would never fly again. The Luftwaffe was slaughtering American bomber crews, and there was nothing the Americans could do about it. The problem was simple. American bombers could reach targets deep inside Germany, but American fighters could not. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the best American fighter in 1943, had a combat radius of about 400 miles. That was enough to escort bombers part way to their targets, but not all the way. Once the fighters turned back, the bombers were on their own, and the Germans knew exactly when that happened. They tracked the American formations on radar. They watched the escort fighters reach their fuel limit and turn for home. Then they attacked. Wave after wave of Bf-109s and FW-190s tearing into the unprotected bomber formations. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 was a formidable opponent. It had been the backbone of the Luftwaffe since the Spanish Civil War. German pilots had been flying it for years. They knew its capabilities, its limitations, its every quirk and characteristic. In the hands of experienced pilots, it was a deadly weapon. And by 1943, the Luftwaffe had a lot of experienced pilots. Men like Adolf Galland, who had over 100 victories. Gerhard Barkhorn, who would finish the war with 301 kills. Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring ace in history, with 352 confirmed victories. These were not amateurs. These were some of the most skilled combat pilots who had ever lived. The American strategic bombing campaign was in danger of failing. If losses continued at this rate, there wouldn't be enough crews or aircraft to sustain the offensive. The Germans would win the air war through simple attrition. And without air superiority, the invasion of Europe would be impossible. The Americans needed a fighter that could go all the way to Berlin and back, a fighter that could stay with the bombers from takeoff to target to landing, a fighter that could meet the Bf-109 on equal terms and win. They needed the P-51 Mustang. The Mustang had an unusual origin. It wasn't designed for the American military at all. It was designed for the British. In April 1940, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American aviation with a request. Britain was at war with Germany and desperately needed fighter aircraft. They wanted North American to build Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license. It was a simple, straightforward deal. But North American's president, James Dutch Kindleberger, had a different idea. The P-40 was already obsolete, he argued. Its performance was mediocre at best. Instead of building someone else's outdated design, why not create something new, something better? He promised he could design and build a prototype in 120 days. The British were skeptical. 120 days to design a completely new fighter from scratch? It was impossible. No one had ever done it that fast. But they were desperate enough to give North American a chance. North American delivered the prototype in 117 days, 3 days ahead of schedule. The NA-73X, as the prototype was designated, first flew on October 26, 1940. It was a beautiful aircraft, with clean, elegant lines that seemed to promise speed. The design incorporated several advanced features: a laminar flow wing that reduced drag, a radiator scoop positioned to actually generate thrust from waste heat, and a structure that was easy to manufacture in large numbers. There was just one problem: the engine. The early Mustangs were powered by the Allison V1710 engine. It was a good engine at low altitudes, producing over 1,000 horsepower. But above 15,000 feet, its performance dropped off sharply. The supercharger simply couldn't deliver enough air at high altitude. This was a serious limitation. Most air combat over Europe took place above 20,000 feet. A fighter that couldn't perform at high altitude was useless for escort duty. The early Mustangs, designated P-51A by the Americans, were relegated to ground attack and reconnaissance work. They were good at that, but they weren't changing the air war. Then someone had an idea that would change everything. The Rolls-Royce Merlin was the finest piston aircraft engine of World War II. It powered the Supermarine Spitfire, the Hawker Hurricane, the Avro Lancaster bomber. It was a proven design with exceptional high-altitude performance, thanks to its two-stage, two-speed supercharger. In April 1942, a test pilot named Ronald Harker flew a Mustang I with the RAF. He was impressed with the airframe's performance, but disappointed by the engine. He wrote a report suggesting that the Mustang be fitted with a Merlin engine. It was a simple idea, but it would transform the aircraft. The conversion wasn't easy. The Merlin was a different size and shape than the Allison. It required a new engine mount, new cooling system, new exhaust manifolds. The engineers at Rolls-Royce and North American worked for months to make it fit. When they finished, they had created a monster. The Merlin-powered Mustang, designated P-51B, first flew in November 1942. Its performance was staggering. Top speed increased from 370 miles per hour to 440 miles per hour. Service ceiling went from 31,000 feet to 42,000 feet. Rate of climb nearly doubled. But the most important number was range. With internal fuel tanks and drop tanks, the P-51B could fly over 2,000 miles. It could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It could stay with the formations from England to the target and all the way home again. For the first time, the Americans had a fighter that could go wherever the bombers went. The Luftwaffe could no longer wait for the escorts to turn back. They would have to fight the Mustangs head-to-head, and that was a fight they were going to lose. To understand why the P-51 dominated the Bf-109, you have to understand what makes a fighter aircraft effective. It's not just about speed or firepower or maneuverability. It's about how all those factors combine in actual combat. Let's start with the basics. On paper, the Bf-109G and the P-51D were fairly evenly matched. The 109 was slightly faster in a climb. The Mustang was slightly faster in level flight. The 109 could turn a bit tighter at low speed. The Mustang could turn better at high speed. Neither aircraft had a decisive advantage in raw performance. But raw performance doesn't tell the whole story, not even close. The Bf-109 was designed in 1934. It was a product of its time, built with the technology and understanding available in the mid-1930s. The wings were small for efficient high-speed flight, but this made the aircraft tricky to handle at low speeds. The landing gear was narrow and attached to the fuselage rather than the wings, which led to countless ground accidents. The cockpit was cramped and the visibility was poor. By 1943, the Bf-109 had been modified and upgraded dozens of times. More powerful engines were squeezed into the same airframe. Heavier armament was bolted on. The basic design was being pushed far beyond what it was ever intended to do. German pilots called the later versions flying coffins because the handling had become so unpredictable. The P-51, by contrast, was designed in 1940 with the benefit of 6 years of aerodynamic research. Its wings were larger and more efficient. Its landing gear was wide and stable. Its cockpit offered excellent visibility in all directions. It was a more modern design, and it showed. But the biggest advantage wasn't aerodynamic, it was strategic. The P-51's extraordinary range changed everything about the air war. German fighters couldn't simply avoid combat until conditions favored them. They had to engage the Mustangs whether they wanted to or not, because the Mustangs were coming to them. Before the Mustang, the Luftwaffe could pick its battles, attack the bombers when the escorts turned back, avoid engagements when conditions are unfavorable, and serve fuel and ammunition for the right moment. After the Mustang, that strategy was impossible. The escorts never turned back. They stayed with the bombers all the way to the target and all the way home. If the Luftwaffe wanted to attack the bombers, they had to go through the Mustangs first. And in early 1944, General Jimmy Doolittle made a decision that sealed the Luftwaffe's fate. Doolittle changed the escort tactics. Previously, American fighters had been ordered to stay close to the bomber formations, protecting them from attack. Doolittle freed the fighters to hunt. They could range ahead of the bombers, looking for German aircraft. They could chase retreating enemies down to the deck. They could strafe airfields and shoot up anything that moved on the ground. The Mustang pilots called it trolling for trains. They would escort the bombers to the target, then spend their remaining fuel hunting. Any German aircraft that took off was a target. Any aircraft on the ground was a target. Any locomotive, any truck, any vehicle that might support the German war effort was fair game. The Luftwaffe was being hunted to extinction. Now let's talk about what happened when the two fighters actually met in combat. The P-51D carried 6 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns with a total of 1,900 rounds of ammunition. Each gun fired 800 rounds per minute. The 50-caliber round was heavy enough to do serious structural damage to an aircraft and accurate enough to hit targets at long range. The Bf-109G typically carried one 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and two 13mm machine guns above the engine. Some variants added additional cannon in pods under the wings, but this degraded performance significantly. The armament was effective against bombers, but less so in fighter-versus-fighter combat, where rate of fire and ammunition capacity mattered more. The Mustang's 6 guns gave it a devastating cone of fire. American pilots learned to fire short bursts, walking their tracers onto the target. The sheer volume of bullets made up for any lack of individual hitting power. German pilots who survived encounters with Mustangs often came back with their aircraft riddled with holes. The Bf-109's armament was designed for a different kind of air combat. The heavy cannon was meant to bring down bombers with a few well-placed shots, but against fast-moving fighters, the slow rate of fire and limited ammunition were serious disadvantages. German pilots often ran out of ammunition before they could score decisive hits. The cockpit visibility was another crucial factor. The P-51D had a bubble canopy that gave the pilot an almost unobstructed view in all directions. He could see threats approaching from any angle. The Bf-109's canopy was more restrictive, with thick frames and a high rear fuselage that created blind spots. German pilots were frequently bounced by Mustangs they never saw coming. In aerial combat, the pilot who sees his enemy first almost always wins. The Mustang's superior visibility gave its pilots a consistent advantage that had nothing to do with speed or maneuverability. They simply saw the Germans before the Germans saw them. But perhaps the most important factor wasn't the aircraft at all. It was the men flying them. In 1943, the average German fighter pilot was a veteran. He had hundreds of hours of combat experience. He knew his aircraft intimately. He had been trained by the best pilots in the world and had survived years of continuous combat. By 1944, those veterans were dying faster than they could be replaced. The Luftwaffe training program couldn't keep up with the losses. New pilots were being sent into combat with as little as 60 hours of flight time. They hadn't mastered the difficult handling of the Bf-109. They hadn't learned the tactics needed to survive against experienced opponents. They were lambs sent to slaughter. The Americans, meanwhile, had the luxury of thorough training. A new P-51 pilot arrived in England with over 200 hours of flight time. He had practiced gunnery, formation flying, instrument procedures. He had been taught by instructors who had survived combat and returned to pass on what they learned. More importantly, America had the industrial capacity to replace its losses many times over. The factories in California and Texas were producing Mustangs faster than the Germans could shoot them down. For every P-51 lost, 3 more came off the assembly line. The Luftwaffe didn't have that luxury. Every Bf-109 destroyed was one fewer they would ever have. The war of attrition was one the Germans could never win, and the Mustang was the weapon that made that attrition inevitable. The German pilots knew what was happening. They could see it in the faces of the new replacements who lasted only a few missions. They could count the empty chairs at dinner. They could watch the kill ratios shift inexorably against them. General Adolf Galland, commander of the Luftwaffe fighter forces, wrote after the war about the moment he realized the air war was lost. It was January 1944. He was watching a formation of American bombers approaching Berlin, escorted by Mustangs. He had never seen American fighters over the capital before. No one had thought it was possible. I was stunned, Galland wrote. I had been told that American fighters could not reach Berlin. I had been assured that our capital was beyond their range, and now they were here, hundreds of them, and they were shooting down our fighters like they were training targets. Galland immediately understood the implications. If the Americans could escort bombers to Berlin, they could escort them anywhere. There was no safe airspace left in Germany. The Luftwaffe would have to fight everywhere, all the time, against an enemy that seemed to have unlimited resources. From that moment, he concluded, we had lost the war. The decisive battle came in February 1944. The Americans called it Big Week. 6 days of maximum effort against the German aircraft industry. Over 3,000 bomber sorties, over 2,000 fighter sorties, the largest air operation in history up to that point. The targets were the factories that produced German fighters, Messerschmitt plants at Regensburg and Augsburg, Focke-Wulf facilities at Oscherleben and Halberstadt, Junkers works at Bernburg and Oscherleben. If the bombers could destroy these factories, the Luftwaffe would slowly run out of aircraft. But the real goal wasn't the factories, it was the Luftwaffe itself. The Americans knew the Germans would have to defend their aircraft factories. They would have to send up every fighter they had, and those fighters would be met by Mustangs, hundreds of Mustangs with orders to seek and destroy. The results were catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. In 6 days, they lost over 600 aircraft. That was a quarter of their total fighter strength, gone in less than a week. Worse, they lost over 200 pilots killed and another 100 captured. These were experienced men who couldn't be replaced. The Americans lost 266 bombers and 28 fighters. Heavy losses by any measure, but the Americans could afford them. The Germans could not. After Big Week, the Luftwaffe was never the same. They could still fight, they could still inflict losses, but they could no longer contest control of the sky. The Americans owned the air over Europe, and they would never give it back. On June 6, 1944, the Allies invaded Normandy. Over 5,000 ships crossed the English Channel. Over 13,000 aircraft flew in support. It was the largest amphibious operation in history. The Luftwaffe was almost completely absent. The Germans managed to fly only about 100 sorties on D-Day. 100 sorties against the largest invasion in history. The contrast with the Allied air forces, which flew over 14,000 sorties, was stark. The Luftwaffe had been beaten so badly that they couldn't even contest the invasion of Western Europe. General Dwight Eisenhower had promised his troops that they would have complete air superiority on D-Day. He kept that promise, and the P-51 Mustang was a major reason why. In the months after D-Day, the Mustangs ranged across occupied Europe, shooting up anything that moved: trains, trucks, tanks, aircraft on the ground. The German transportation network collapsed. Reinforcements couldn't reach the front. Supplies couldn't get through. The Wehrmacht was being strangled from the air. The Bf 109 pilots who were still alive kept fighting. They had no choice, but they knew every mission might be their last. The odds against them got worse every day. More Mustangs, fewer 109s, better American pilots, worse German fuel. It was a losing battle, and everyone knew it. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the statistics told a brutal story. American fighters claimed over 15,000 German aircraft destroyed. The P-51 Mustang accounted for nearly half of those kills. It achieved an air-to-air kill ratio of over 7-to-1 against all German fighters, and over 10-to-1 in some months of 1944. The Luftwaffe lost over 40,000 pilots during the war. Many of them fell to Mustangs. The great aces who had terrorized Europe in 1940 and 1941 were almost all dead by 1945. Galland survived only because he was grounded by Hitler after political disputes. Most of his contemporaries weren't so lucky. The Bf 109, which had been the most successful fighter in the world when the war began, ended as a death trap for the young pilots sent up in it. The aircraft itself was capable, but the men flying it were too inexperienced to exploit its capabilities. They died in droves, shot down by American pilots who had been flying longer and training better. The P-51 Mustang didn't just beat the Bf 109, It destroyed the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force. It gave the Allies the air superiority they needed to invade Europe. It protected the bombers that flattened German industry. It made victory possible. The cockpit visibility was another crucial factor. The P-51D had a bubble canopy that gave the pilot an almost unobstructed view in all directions. He could see threats approaching from any angle. The Bf-109's canopy was more restrictive, with thick frames and a high rear fuselage that created blind spots. German pilots were frequently bounced by Mustangs they never saw coming. In aerial combat, the pilot who sees his enemy first almost always wins. The Mustang's superior visibility gave its pilots a consistent advantage that had nothing to do with speed or maneuverability. They simply saw the Germans before the Germans saw them. But perhaps the most important factor wasn't the aircraft at all. It was the men flying them. In 1943, the average German fighter pilot was a veteran. He had hundreds of hours of combat experience. He knew his aircraft intimately. He had been trained by the best pilots in the world and had survived years of continuous combat. By 1944, those veterans were dying faster than they could be replaced. The Luftwaffe training program couldn't keep up with the losses. New pilots were being sent into combat with as little as 60 hours of flight time. They hadn't mastered the difficult handling of the Bf-109. They hadn't learned the tactics needed to survive against experienced opponents. They were lambs sent to slaughter.